At 2:17 a.m. on September 8, 1944, Commander William Bill Hartigan ordered his submarine to die. 34 years old, 11 months in command, 0 confirmed kills. The USS Blackfin was a Beilao-class fleet submarine, 312 feet of American steel designed to hunt Japanese shipping in the Pacific. She carried 24 torpedoes, a 4-inch deck gun, and a crew of 81 men who had spent the last 3 months patrolling the most dangerous waters in the world without firing a single shot. The Beilao class was the workhorse of the submarine war, an improved version of the earlier Gado class, with a stronger hull that could dive to 400 feet instead of 300. She displaced 1,500 tons surfaced, 2,400 tons submerged, and could make 20 knots on the surface or 9 knots underwater. Her 4 diesel engines gave her a range of 11,000 miles, enough to patrol the vast reaches of the Pacific for weeks at a time. But a submarine was only as good as her captain, and Commander William Hartigan was starting to wonder if he was any good at all. It wasn't for lack of trying. Hartigan had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1932, served on battleships and cruisers through the Depression years, and volunteered for submarine duty in 1939. He'd spent 2 years as an executive officer on the USS Pollock, learning the trade from one of the best skippers in the fleet. When the war came, he'd been ready, or so he thought. His first command had been the USS 38. An ancient boat from the First World War that had been operating in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked. He'd made 3 patrols in that creaking relic, dodging Japanese destroyers and launching torpedoes that more often than not failed to explode. When the S-38 was finally retired in 1943, Hartigan had been given the Blackfin, a brand new boat with all the latest equipment. The equipment didn't help. The Blackfin had left Fremantle, Australia on June 3rd with orders to patrol the Luzon Strait, the narrow passage between the Philippines and Taiwan, where Japanese convoys funneled supplies to their island garrisons. It was a target-rich environment, the kind of hunting ground that had made legends of submarine commanders like Dudley Morton and Sam Dealey. Ships passed through the strait every day. Tankers and freighters and troop transports, all of them vulnerable to a well-placed torpedo. But Commander Hartigan hadn't sunk any of them. His first attack on June 19th had been a textbook approach on a medium-sized freighter. 4 torpedoes at 1,200 yards. All 4 had missed or failed to detonate. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard armament of the American submarine fleet, had a reputation for running too deep, veering off course, or simply refusing to explode when it hit a target. Hartigan had watched through the periscope as his torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath the freighter's hull. His second attack, 3 weeks later, had been worse. He'd fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at a tanker convoy, heard 2 explosions, and surfaced to find nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no sinking ships. The explosions had been premature detonations, torpedoes that had blown up before reaching their targets, alerting the convoy to the submarine's presence without causing any damage. After that, the escorts had found him. The depth charging had lasted 4 hours. The Blackfin had taken 17 near misses, lost her air conditioning, sprung leaks in 3 compartments, and barely escaped with her pressure hull intact. Hartigan had limped back to Fremantle with a boat that needed 6 weeks of repairs and a crew that was starting to wonder if their captain knew what he was doing. Now he was back on patrol, with a repaired boat and a fresh load of torpedoes, and he'd found what looked like the opportunity of a lifetime, a Japanese aircraft carrier. If you're new to WW2 Tales, welcome. This channel covers the incredible true stories of ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances during the Second World War. We upload every week, so subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And stick around to the end of this video, because what Commander Hartigan did in the next 3 hours would turn a disaster into one of the most audacious submarine attacks of the Pacific War. The carrier was the Unyo, a 20,000-ton escort carrier that had been converted from a passenger liner early in the war. She wasn't a fleet carrier like the ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, but she was still a prize beyond anything Hartigan had dared to hope for. Aircraft carriers were the most valuable targets in the Pacific, and sinking one would erase every failure on his record. The Unyo was traveling with a heavy escort, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort, all of them equipped with sonar and depth charges. The convoy was making 15 knots on a zigzag pattern, heading northwest toward the Philippines. Hartigan had spotted them at dusk, tracked them through the night, and maneuvered the Blackfin into a firing position ahead of their projected course. At 2:14 a.m., he'd fired 4 torpedoes at the carrier from 1,800 yards. At 2:15 a.m., he'd heard 1 explosion. At 2:16 a.m., all hell had broken loose. The destroyers had reacted instantly. Even as the single torpedo struck the Unyo's stern, the escorts were already turning toward the Blackfin's firing position. Japanese sonar, primitive by American standards but deadly effective in the hands of experienced operators, had pinpointed the submarine within seconds of the attack. Hartigan had ordered an emergency dive. The Blackfin had gone deep, her hull groaning as the pressure increased, her crew bracing for the depth charges they knew were coming. They came at 2:17 a.m. The first pattern was close. 6 charges that bracketed the submarine and sent shockwaves rippling through the hull. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. A valve in the forward torpedo room burst, sending a spray of seawater across the compartment before the crew could wrestle it closed. Japanese depth charges carried 200 pounds of Type 88 explosive, enough to crack a submarine's pressure hull if they detonated within 20 feet. The standard attack pattern was to drop charges in a diamond formation, set to explode at different depths, creating a 3-dimensional kill zone that a submarine couldn't escape. The Blackfin was somewhere in the middle of that zone. Torpedo Man First Class Vincent Caruso was in the forward room when the charges hit. He'd been checking the reload torpedoes, making sure the complex weapons were ready for a second attack if the first salvo didn't sink the carrier. When the explosions came, he was thrown against a torpedo rack hard enough to crack 2 ribs. He barely noticed. There was water coming in, and that mattered more than pain. "Hull valve, frame 22, someone shouted. Caruso grabbed a wrench and lunged for the valve, fighting against the spray of seawater that was already soaking the deck. The valve wheel was stuck, corroded probably, or warped by the pressure of the explosion. He put his full weight on the wrench, felt the metal groan, and finally got the wheel to turn. The spray slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Behind him, the watertight door to the torpedo room slammed shut. Standard procedure: isolate the damaged compartment, contain the flooding, save the boat. Caruso and the other men in the forward room were sealed in with whatever air they had. The second pattern was closer. The charges exploded directly above the Blackfin, hammering her deck with concussive force that knocked men off their feet and sent unsecured equipment flying. The depth gauge needle swung wildly as the submarine was pushed deeper by the blasts. Paint flaked from the bulkheads. The hull flexed visibly, steel bending under pressures it was never designed to withstand. In the control room, Chief of the boat, Harold Boats Muller, clung to the diving station and watched the depth gauge climb. 350 feet, 375 feet, 390 feet. They were approaching test depth, the point beyond which the Navy couldn't guarantee the hull would hold. "Below negative to the mark," Commander Hartigan ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Muller hit the valve, sending a burst of compressed air into the negative buoyancy tank. The submarine's descent slowed, then stopped at 392 feet, 8 feet from the limit. And then the third pattern hit. One of the charges detonated less than 20 feet from the Blackfin's stern. The explosion ruptured the outer hull, cracked a fuel tank, and sent a plume of diesel oil streaming toward the surface. Inside the submarine, the lights went out. The main motors died. The boat began to sink, her buoyancy compromised by the flooding in her after compartments. In the maneuvering room, electrician's mate second class Tommy Hayward was thrown across the compartment when the blast hit. He landed against the main electrical panel, his shoulder taking the impact, and felt something give way in his arm. Dislocated, probably. He didn't have time to think about it. The panel was sparking. Seawater was finding its way into the electrical systems, and if it reached the main bus, the resulting short circuit would kill the batteries, and probably everyone in the compartment. "Get me a blanket!" Hayward shouted, cradling his useless arm. "Something to cover the panel!" Someone threw him a fire blanket. He draped it over the sparking connections with his good hand, buying them a few minutes, maybe less. The water was still coming in. In the darkness, Commander Hartigan made a decision. All stop, he said quietly. Rig for silent running. Shut down everything. Ventilation, pumps, everything. I want this boat dead. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Rossi, stared at him in the red glow of the emergency lights. Sir, if we shut down the pumps, we'll flood. We're already taking water in the after-engine room. I know. Sir, the crew... I know, Frank. Hartigan's voice was calm, almost gentle. But those destroyers are going to keep dropping charges until they're sure we're dead. The only way to make them sure is to show them a corpse. He turned to the control room crew. Pass the word. Nobody moves, nobody speaks, nobody breathes loud. We're going to play dead until those bastards go away. The Blackfin settled toward the bottom. At 412 feet, well below her rated test depth of 400 feet, she touched down on a sandy ledge and stopped sinking. The hull creaked ominously, protesting the pressure that was squeezing her from all sides. Somewhere aft, water continued to trickle into the boat, a slow leak that the silent pumps couldn't address. Above them, the Japanese destroyers circled like sharks. Playing dead was an old submarine trick, but it was also a desperate one. The idea was simple. After a depth charge attack, a submarine would shut down all machinery, drift to the bottom, and wait for the enemy to lose interest. If the attackers saw oil and debris rising to the surface, they might conclude that the submarine had been destroyed and move on. The problem was that playing dead could easily become being dead. Without the pumps running, water accumulated in the bilges. Without ventilation, carbon dioxide built up in the air. Without the main motors, the submarine couldn't maneuver if the destroyers found her again. A submarine playing dead was betting everything on a single hope, that the enemy would give up before the crew suffocated or the boat flooded. Commander Hartigan was betting 81 lives on that hope. The first hour was the worst. The Japanese destroyers made 3 more depth charge runs, each one searching for the submarine they damaged. The charges fell in patterns around the Blackfin's last known position, some of them close enough to rattle the hull, none of them close enough to cause additional damage. The oil slick from the ruptured fuel tank was spreading across the surface, and the destroyers seemed convinced that their target was somewhere beneath it. Inside the Blackfin, the crew waited in silence. The temperature began to rise almost immediately. Without ventilation, the heat from 81 bodies and the still warm machinery had nowhere to go. Within 30 minutes, the thermometer in the control room read 95 degrees. Within an hour, it read 108. Men stripped to their skivvies trying to cool off. It didn't help. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of sweat and diesel and fear. Some men pressed themselves against the hull, seeking the relative coolness of the steel. Others lay motionless on the deck, conserving energy, trying not to breathe any more than necessary. The carbon dioxide concentration rose steadily. At 2% CO2, men began to feel headaches and shortness of breath. At 3%, the headaches became severe, and some men started to feel dizzy. At 4%, confusion set in. Men who'd been submarine sailors for years suddenly forgot where they were, what they were doing, why they were lying in the dark in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean. Chief Pharmacist's mate, Leonard Kowalski, moved through the boat with a CO2 indicator, checking the air quality in each compartment. The readings got worse every time. By 3:30 a.m., just over an hour since the attack, the CO2 in the forward torpedo room had reached 4.2%. The symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning were well known to submarine crews. Everyone had been trained to recognize the signs: headaches, drowsiness, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness and death. The standard Navy limit for CO2 concentration was 3%, but submarines routinely operated at higher levels during extended dives. The question was how much higher they could go before men started dying. In the forward torpedo room, Caruso was starting to see spots at the edges of his vision. His headache had become a constant throbbing pressure behind his eyes, and his thoughts were moving slowly, like he was trying to think through molasses. The other men in the compartment were in similar shape, slumped against the bulkheads, breathing in shallow gasps, fighting to stay conscious. One of them, Torpedoman 3rd Class Eddie Fitzgerald, a kid from Boston who'd only been aboard for 3 months, had stopped fighting. He was lying on the deck, eyes closed, chest barely moving. Caruso crawled over to him and checked his pulse. Still alive, just unconscious. He didn't know whether that was better or worse. In the control room, Commander Hartigan sat on the deck with his back against the plotting table, conserving energy like everyone else. The emergency lights had dimmed to a faint red glow, barely enough to see the depth gauge on the far side of the compartment. The air was thick and warm and tasted like metal. Hartigan had commanded submarines for 3 years. He'd been through depth charge attacks before, experienced the terror of being hunted by an enemy he couldn't see, but he'd never been through anything like this. This slow, suffocating wait, this gamble that the enemy would give up before his crew gave out. He thought about the men depending on him, 81 sailors, most of them young, most of them with families waiting back home. They'd trusted him to lead them, to make the right decisions, to bring them home alive. And now they were sitting on the bottom of the ocean, slowly dying because he decided to play dead instead of run. Had he made the right call? He didn't know. He couldn't know. All he could do was wait and see. "Skipper," Kowalski reported quietly, "we're approaching the danger zone. Another hour at this rate, and we'll start losing men." Hartigan nodded. He'd expected this. The question was whether the Japanese would give up before his crew gave out. "How's the water situation?" "After engine room is at 3 feet and rising. Maneuvering room has about 18 inches. We can hold for maybe 2 more hours before we're in serious trouble." 2 hours. That was the window. If the destroyers were still hunting them in 2 hours, they'd have to risk starting the pumps, and probably give away their position in the process. Hartigan checked his watch. 3:33 a.m. He'd give the Japanese until 5:30. If they were still circling at dawn, he'd have to surface and fight it out with the deck gun, a battle the Blackfin couldn't possibly win. But if they left before then? Above them, the destroyers continued their search. The second hour was quieter. The depth charge attacks had stopped. The destroyers were still circling. The Blackfin's crew could hear their propellers through the hull, a distant thrum that rose and fell as the ships passed overhead. But they weren't dropping any more charges. They were listening, searching for any sign that the submarine beneath them was still alive. The Blackfin gave them nothing. Hartigan had ordered absolute silence, and his crew obeyed with the discipline of men who understood their lives depended on it. No one spoke, no one moved unless absolutely necessary. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the hull and the soft drip of water in the after compartments. In the forward torpedo room, Caruso and his 5 companions sat in the darkness and tried not to breathe too loudly. The air was already getting thick. With the watertight door sealed, they had no ventilation at all. Caruso could feel the carbon dioxide building, a heaviness in his lungs that made every breath feel inadequate. He thought about his wife back in Brooklyn. Maria would be sleeping now, unaware that her husband was sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, slowly suffocating in a steel tube. He'd promised her he'd come home. He'd promised her they'd have kids, buy a house, live the life they'd dreamed about since high school. He wondered if he'd be able to keep that promise. In the maneuvering room, Tommy Hayward sat with his back against the bulkhead and cradled his dislocated shoulder. The pain had settled into a dull throb that spiked every time he moved. The fire blanket was still draped over the electrical panel, but the sparking had stopped. Either the short had burned itself out, or the water had found another path. His shipmates sat around him in the darkness, not speaking, barely moving. Motor machinist's mate, First Class George Orwell, no relation to the writer, he always said, was mouthing something that looked like a prayer. Electrician's mate Third Class Paul Kim was staring at the overhead, his face blank, his mind somewhere else entirely. They were all waiting for the depth charges to start again, waiting for the hull to crack, waiting for the air to run out, waiting for something, anything, to break the terrible suspense. Time crawled. At 4:15 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Rossi touched Hartigan's arm and pointed upward. The propeller sounds were changing. Instead of the steady circling pattern they'd maintained for the past 2 hours, the destroyers were moving away, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. They were leaving. Hartigan held up a hand, signaling for continued silence. It could be a trick. Japanese destroyer captains sometimes pretended to leave, then cut their engines and drifted back, hoping to catch a submarine in the act of surfacing. He'd heard stories of boats that had been sunk that way, crews who'd thought they were safe and discovered too late that they weren't. They waited. At 4:45 a.m., the propeller sounds faded to nothing. The ocean above the Blackfin was silent. Still Hartigan waited. At 5 a.m., with the CO2 at 4.8% and men starting to lose consciousness, he finally gave the order. "Start the low-pressure blower. Bring us up to periscope depth, quietly." The Blackfin rose like a ghost from the bottom. It took 20 minutes to reach 60 feet, 20 minutes of careful, silent maneuvering, bleeding air into the ballast tanks, one careful burst at a time. The crew moved in slow motion, dizzy from the carbon dioxide. Their movements clumsy and uncertain. 2 men in the forward torpedo room had passed out and had to be carried to better ventilated compartments. But they made it. At 5:22 a.m., Commander Hartigan raised the periscope and looked out at the pre-dawn Pacific. The destroyers were gone, but the Unyo wasn't. The carrier was still afloat. She was listing badly to starboard, down by the stern, obviously damaged by the torpedo that had struck her 3 hours earlier. But she was still moving, making maybe 5 knots, limping northwest toward the Philippines, with one of her destroyers standing by as an escort. The other destroyer and the destroyer escort were nowhere to be seen, probably called away to hunt for other submarines or to escort other convoys. Smoke was rising from somewhere amidships, a fire that the damage control teams hadn't been able to extinguish. Her flight deck was canted at an angle that would make landing aircraft impossible, and her island superstructure showed scorch marks from what might have been an internal explosion. The torpedo had hurt her badly, but she was a tough ship. She'd survive if she could reach port. Hartigan stared through the periscope, doing calculations in his head. The Unyo was 8 miles away, moving at 5 knots, escorted by a single destroyer. The Blackfin was damaged, flooded compartments, depleted batteries, a crew that was barely functional after 3 hours of oxygen deprivation. By any reasonable standard, the smart move was to let the carrier go, surface to ventilate the boat and recharge the batteries, and report the probable sinking by radio. Hartigan had spent 11 months being reasonable, 11 months following the rules, playing it safe, coming home with empty tubes and excuses, 11 months watching other captains rack up kills while he explained why his torpedoes hadn't worked. He was done being reasonable. But Bill Hartigan hadn't spent 11 months commanding a submarine without sinking anything just to let an aircraft carrier limp away. "Frank," he said quietly, "plot me an intercept course." Rossi looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Sir, we're in no condition to—" "I didn't ask for a condition report. I asked for a course." Rossi hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, sir." The executive officer bent over the plotting table, working out the geometry of the attack. The Unyo was making 5 knots on a heading of 315 degrees. The Blackfin was 8 miles to the southeast, capable of maybe 3 knots on her damaged batteries. To intercept, they'd need to run almost due north for 90 minutes, arriving at a point ahead of the carrier's track just as dawn was breaking. It would be the longest 90 minutes of their lives. The approach took an hour and a half. The Blackfin crept through the water at 3 knots, her damaged batteries providing barely enough power to turn the screws. Hartigan kept the periscope raised only in brief intervals, minimizing the risk of detection, tracking the wounded carrier by the sound of her struggling engines. Inside the boat, the ventilation system slowly cleared the carbon dioxide from the air. Men who'd been on the edge of unconsciousness began to recover, their headaches fading, their minds clearing. The pumps dealt with the flooding in the after compartments, bringing the water level down to something manageable. The Blackfin wasn't healthy, but she was functional. At 6:48 a.m., Hartigan raised the periscope for a final observation. The Unyo was 1,400 yards away, broadside to the Blackfin, dead in the water. Her engines had finally given out, and she was wallowing in the light swells, waiting for tugs that would never arrive. The escorting destroyer was circling her slowly, its sonar probing the water for threats. Through the periscope, Hartigan could see sailors on the carrier's deck, damage control parties still fighting the fires, officers on the bridge trying to coordinate the rescue effort, enlisted men lining the rails and staring out at the empty ocean. They had no idea the Blackfin was less than a mile away, watching them, waiting for the right moment. The Mark 18 electric torpedo was a relatively new weapon introduced in 1943 to address some of the problems with the older Mark 14. Unlike the Mark 14, which left a visible wake of bubbles as it ran, the Mark 18 was nearly invisible. Its electric motor produced no exhaust, no trail, no warning. A ship could be hit by a Mark 18 without ever knowing where the attack had come from. The Blackfin had 8 Mark 18 in her forward tubes. 4 had been fired at the Unyo 3 hours earlier. 1 had hit, 3 had either missed or malfunctioned. Now Hartigan had 4 more, and he intended to use them all. Hartigan watched the destroyer's pattern, timing its rotations. Every 90 seconds, the escort passed between the Blackfin and the carrier. Every 90 seconds, there was a 30-second window when the submarine had a clear shot. The destroyer was currently on the far side of its pattern, its stern to the Blackfin, its sonar pointed away. In 60 seconds, it would begin its turn back toward the submarine's position. Hartigan had to fire now. Forward tubes 1 through 4, make ready, Hartigan ordered. In the forward torpedo room, Caruso and his team worked with the mechanical precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. The tube outer doors swung open, the firing circuits were armed, the gyroscopes spun up to speed, ready to guide the weapons to their target. Tubes 1 through 4, ready, sir. Final bearing and shoot. Lieutenant Commander Rossi called out the bearing from the torpedo data computer, the mechanical calculator that translated periscope observations into firing solutions. Bearing, mark. Fire 1. The first torpedo left the tube with a hiss of compressed air. The Blackfin shuddered slightly as a ton of high explosive departed her bow. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4. Mark 18 electric torpedoes, each carrying 570 pounds of Torpex explosive, raced toward the Unyo at 30 knots. Hartigan lowered the periscope and waited. The control room was silent. Every man aboard knew what was at stake. If the torpedoes hit, they'd have accomplished something extraordinary. If they missed, the destroyer would be on them within minutes. And this time, there would be no playing dead. The Blackfin didn't have another 3 hours of air. 60 seconds, 90 seconds. At 94 seconds, the first torpedo hit. The explosion was enormous, far larger than the single hit 3 hours earlier. The torpedo had struck the Unyo amidships, directly beneath her aviation fuel storage. The fuel ignited, sending a column of fire 200 feet into the air. The blast wave rippled across the water, rocking the escorting destroyer and showering debris across a quarter-mile radius. The second torpedo hit 3 seconds later, and the third 2 seconds after that. The fourth torpedo, whether by malfunction or miscalculation, passed astern of the sinking carrier and disappeared into the empty ocean. But 3 hits were more than enough. The Unyo broke in half. Hartigan raised the periscope just in time to see the carrier's bow section rear up out of the water, hang suspended for a moment, and then slide beneath the surface. The stern section was already gone, dragged down by the flooding in the after compartments. Oil and debris spread across the water in an expanding circle, mixing with the bodies of sailors who'd been thrown overboard by the explosions. For a long moment, no one in the control room spoke. They'd done it. After 11 months of failure, after 3 hours of playing dead, they'd actually done it. An aircraft carrier, 20,000 tons of Japanese naval aviation, was sinking to the bottom of the Luzon Strait. Then the destroyer's propeller started turning. The escorting destroyer was racing toward the Blackfin's position, her bow wave white against the dark water, her depth charges already rolling off the stern racks. But she was too late. The Unyo was gone, and Hartigan was already taking his submarine deep. All ahead full. Make your depth 300 feet. Rig for depth charge. The Blackfin dove. The depth charges came, a dozen of them, maybe more, exploding in a ragged pattern across the submarine's track. But the destroyer's captain was panicked, dropping charges too soon and too shallow. None of them came close. By 7:30 a.m., the Blackfin was clear. She surfaced 2 hours later, 30 miles from the site of the attack, to ventilate her compartments and assess the damage. The crew stumbled onto the deck, blinking in the morning sunlight, breathing air that didn't taste like diesel and death. The damage report was sobering. The after-engine room had taken 3 feet of water before the pumps brought it under control. The number 4 main engine was out of commission, its mountings cracked by the depth charge blasts. The periscope shears were bent, the radar antenna was gone, and there were 17 separate hull patches that would need attention before the boat could dive to full depth again. But the Blackfin was alive. Her crew was alive, and somewhere behind them, an aircraft carrier was settling into its grave on the floor of the Luzon Strait. Chief Pharmacist's mate Kowalski moved through the boat, checking on men who'd been affected by the carbon dioxide. Most were recovering quickly now that they had fresh air, headaches fading, confusion clearing, strength returning. A few would need more time. Tommy Hayward's shoulder had been popped back into place by one of his shipmates, but he'd be wearing a sling for weeks. Vincent Caruso's cracked ribs would heal on their own, given time. Nobody had died. After everything that had happened, the depth charges, the flooding, the 3 hours of playing dead, they hadn't lost a single man. Commander Hartigan stood on the bridge and looked back toward the horizon where the Unyo had gone down. 11 months without a kill, 3 hours playing dead at the bottom of the ocean, and now, finally, an aircraft carrier on his record. It had been worth the wait. The Blackfin limped into Fremantle 12 days later, her hull scarred by depth charge damage, her crew exhausted but triumphant. They'd made the journey on 3 engines instead of 4, running on the surface at night and submerging during the day to avoid Japanese patrol planes. The navigator had plotted a course that kept them away from known convoy routes, minimizing the chance of another encounter they couldn't afford. Word of the Unyo sinking had reached Fremantle before them. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had intercepted Japanese communications reporting the loss, and the submarine command had already credited the kill to the Blackfin. By the time they tied up at the pier, a small crowd had gathered. Officers from other boats, yard workers who'd heard the story, reporters who wanted to interview the captain who'd risen from the dead to sink a carrier. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, commander of submarines in the Southwest Pacific, was waiting on the pier. Christie had a reputation for being hard on captains who came back without results, and Hartigan had spent 11 months giving him nothing but excuses. Now he had something different. 20,000 tons, Christie said, reading the patrol report. An escort carrier, and you went back for her after they thought they'd sunk you. Yes, sir. Christie looked up from the report, his expression unreadable. Commander, that was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. I've been wondering about that myself, sir. Christie was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. The Navy Cross, he said. I'm recommending you for the Navy Cross. And a new boat. The Blackfin needs 6 months in the yard after what you put her through. And I need aggressive captains at sea. He extended his hand. Congratulations, Bill. You've earned it. The story of the Blackfin's resurrection spread through the submarine force within days. It became one of those tales that skippers told each other in the officers' clubs at Fremantle and Pearl Harbor. The boat that played dead for 3 hours and then came back to sink the ship that thought it had killed her. The official after-action report was more restrained. It noted that Commander Hartigan had displayed exceptional persistence and tactical judgment, and had contributed materially to the reduction of Japanese naval aviation capacity. It mentioned the 3 hours at the bottom, the rising CO2, the crew that had held together through conditions that would have broken lesser men. What it didn't mention was the look on Hartigan's face when he'd seen the Unyo still afloat, the quiet fury of a man who'd spent 11 months being told he wasn't good enough, finally getting his chance to prove otherwise. Some things don't fit in after-action reports. Bill Hartigan commanded 2 more submarines before the war ended. He sank 11 ships totaling 58,000 tons, making him one of the most successful submarine commanders of the final year of the Pacific War. The failures that had plagued his early career, the missed shots, the torpedo malfunctions, the long patrols without results, were forgotten, replaced by a reputation for aggressive tactics and unshakable nerve. After the war, he stayed in the Navy. He commanded a submarine squadron during the Korean War, served on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations, and retired in 1962 as a Rear Admiral. His Navy Cross hung in his study next to a photograph of the Blackfin's crew taken the day after the Unyo sinking. 81 exhausted men grinning at the camera like they just won the lottery. In interviews, Hartigan rarely talked about the 3 hours at the bottom. When pressed, he'd shrug and change the subject. "It wasn't heroic," he said once. "It was just waiting. Anybody can wait." But the men who'd waited with him knew better. Chief Pharmacist's mate, Leonard Kowalski, who'd monitored the CO2 levels as they climbed toward lethal concentrations, stayed in touch with his former captain for decades. In a letter written in 1978, he tried to explain what those 3 hours had meant to the crew. "We were dying down there," he wrote, "slowly, quietly, but dying. The air was poison, the water was rising, and the skipper just sat there in the dark, calm as Sunday morning, waiting for his moment. That's when we knew we'd make it. Not because the situation was good, it wasn't, but because he believed we would, and he made us believe it too." That's what leadership is, isn't it? Making men believe in something when all the evidence says they shouldn't. Bill Hartigan died in 1989 at the age of 79. His obituary mentioned the Navy Cross, the 11 ships, the successful career that had followed the war. It didn't mention the 3 hours on the bottom of the Luzon Strait, the 3 hours that had transformed a failed submarine commander into a legend. But the men of the Blackfin remembered. At his funeral, a former torpedo man named Sal Benedetto stood up to speak. He'd been 22 years old on the night of the Unyo attack, one of the men who'd passed out from carbon dioxide poisoning in the forward torpedo room. He'd spent 50 years thinking about what had happened that night, and he'd finally figured out what he wanted to say. "The Japanese thought they killed us," he said. "They dropped their charges, saw our oil coming up, and figured we were done. They went back to their carrier, probably congratulated themselves on a job well done, probably thought about the medals they'd get." He paused, looking at the flag-draped coffin. "They were wrong. We weren't dead. We were just waiting. Waiting for them to get comfortable. Waiting for them to let their guard down. Waiting for our moment." And when that moment came, Commander Hartigan took it. He took that carrier to the bottom, and he brought all of us home. Benedetto raised his hand in a salute. "Rest easy, Skipper. The boat's secure. The crew's accounted for. You can stand down now." The honor guard folded the flag. Taps played across the cemetery. And somewhere beneath the waves of the Pacific, the ghosts of the Unyo's crew finally understood what had happened on that September morning in 1944. They hadn't killed the Blackfin, they'd just made her angry. If you want to see more stories like this, check out one of these videos here. We'll see you next time.